Chapter 25 of Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Dan. Chapter 25. "This is where I was a prisoner for 3 days, he murmured to me. It was on the occasion of our visit to the Rajah, while we were making our way slowly through a kind of awestruck riot of dependents across Tunku Alang's courtyard. Filthy place, isn't it? And I couldn't get anything to eat either, unless I made a row about it, and then it was only a small plate of rice and a fried fish not much bigger than a stickleback. Confound them. Jove, I've been hungry prowling inside this stinking enclosure with some of these vagabonds shoving their mugs right under my nose. I'd given up that famous revolver of yours at the first demand. Glad to get rid of the bally thing. Looked like a fool walking about with an empty shooting iron in my hand. At that moment we came into the presence, and he became unflinchingly grave and complimentary with his late captor. Oh, magnificent! I want to laugh when I think of it. But I was impressed, too. The old disreputable Tunku Alang could not help showing his fear. He was no hero for all the tales of his hot youth he was fond of telling. And at the same time there was a wistful confidence in his manner towards his late prisoner. Note: even where he would be most hated, he was still trusted. Jim, as far as I could follow the conversation, was improving the occasion by the delivery of a lecture. Some poor villagers had been waylaid and robbed while on their way to Doraman's house with a few pieces of gum or beeswax which they wished to exchange for rice. "It was Doraman who was the thief," burst out the Rajah. A shaking fury seemed to enter that old frail body. He writhed weirdly on his mat, gesticulating with his hands and feet, tossing the tangled strings of his mop, an impotent incarnation of rage. There were staring eyes and dropping jaws all around. Jim began to speak. Resolutely, coolly, and for some time he enlarged upon the text that no man should be prevented from getting his food and his children's food honestly. The other sat like a tailor at his board, one palm on each knee, his head low, and fixing Jim through the grey hair that fell over his very eyes. When Jim had done, there was a great stillness. Nobody seemed to breathe even. No one made a sound till the old Rajah sighed faintly, and looking up with a toss of his head, said quickly, "You hear, my people, no more of these little games." This decree was received in profound silence. A rather heavy man, evidently in a position of confidence, with intelligent eyes, a bony, broad, very dark face, and a cheerily officious manner — I learned later on he was the executioner — presented to us 2 cups of coffee on a brass tray, which he took from the hands of an inferior attendant. "You needn't drink," muttered Jim very rapidly. I didn't perceive the meaning at first, and only looked at him. He took a good sip and sat composedly, holding the saucer in his left hand. In a moment I felt excessively annoyed. "Why the devil," I whispered, smiling at him amiably, "do you expose me to such a stupid risk?" I drank, of course. There was nothing for it, while he gave no sign, and almost immediately afterwards we took our leave. While we were going down the courtyard to our boat, escorted by the intelligent and cheery executioner, Jim said he was very sorry. It was the barest chance, of course. Personally he thought nothing of poison. The remotest chance. He was, he assured me, considered to be infinitely more useful than dangerous, and so. "But the Rajah is afraid of you abominably. Anybody can see that," I argued, with, I own, a certain peevishness, and all the time watching anxiously for the first twist of some sort of ghastly colic. I was awfully disgusted. "If I am to do any good here and preserve my position," he said, taking his seat by my side in the boat, "I must stand the risk. I take it once every month at least. Many people trust me to do that, for them." "Afraid of me? That's just it. Most likely he is afraid of me, because I am not afraid of his coffee." Then, showing me a place on the north front of the stockade, where the pointed tops of several stakes were broken, "This is where I leapt over on my 3rd day in Patusan. They haven't put new stakes there yet. Good leap, eh?" A moment later we passed the mouth of a muddy creek. "This is my 2nd leap. I had a bit of a run and took this one flying, but fell short. Thought I would leave my skin there. Lost my shoes, struggling, and all the time I was thinking to myself how beastly it would be to get a jab with a ballylong spear while sticking in the mud like this. I remember how sick I felt wriggling in that slime. I mean really sick. as if I had bitten something rotten. That's how it was, and the opportunity ran by his side, leapt over the gap, floundered in the mud, still veiled. The unexpectedness of his coming was the only thing, you understand, that saved him from being at once dispatched with krisses and flung into the river. They had him, but it was like getting hold of an apparition, a wraith, a portent. What did it mean? What to do with it? Was it too late to conciliate him? Hadn't he better be killed without more delay? But what would happen then? Wretched old Allang went nearly mad with apprehension and through the difficulty of making up his mind. Several times the council was broken up, and the advisers made a break, helter-skelter for the door and out onto the veranda. One, it was said, even jumped down to the ground, 15 feet, I should judge, and broke his leg. The royal governor of Patusan had bizarre mannerisms, and one of them was to introduce boastful rhapsodies into every arduous discussion, when, getting gradually excited, he would end by flying off his perch with a kriss in his hand. But, barring such interruptions, the deliberations upon Jim's fate went on night and day. Meanwhile he wandered about the courtyard, shunned by some, glared at by others, but watched by all, and practically at the mercy of the first casual ragamuffin with a chopper in there. He took possession of a small tumble-down shed to sleep in. The effluvia of filth and rotten matter incommoded him greatly. It seems he had not lost his appetite, though, because, he told me, he had been hungry all the blessed time. Now and again some fussy ass deputed from the council-room would come out running to him, and in honeyed tones would administer amazing interrogatories. Were the Dutch coming to take the country? Would the white man like to go back down the river? What was the object of coming to such a miserable country? The Rajah wanted to know whether the white man could repair a watch. They did actually bring out to him a nickel clock of New England make, and out of sheer unbearable boredom he busied himself in trying to get the alarum to work. It was apparently when thus occupied in his shed that the true perception of his extreme peril dawned upon him. He dropped the thing, he says, like a hot potato, and walked out hastily, without the slightest idea of what he would, or indeed could, do. He only knew that the position was intolerable. He strolled aimlessly beyond a sort of ramshackle little granary on posts, and his eyes fell on the broken stakes of the palisade, and then, he says, at once, without any mental process, as it were, without any stir of emotion, he set about his escape as if executing a plan matured for a month. He walked off carelessly to give himself a good run, and when he faced about there was some dignitary with 2 spearmen in attendance close at his elbow, ready with a question. He started off from under his very nose, went over like a bird, and landed on the other side with a fall that jarred all his bones and seemed to split his head. He picked himself up instantly. He never thought of anything at the time. All he could remember, he said, was a great yell. The first houses of Patusan were before him 400 yards away. He saw the creek, and, as it were mechanically, put on more pace. The earth seemed fairly to fly backwards under his feet. He took off from the last dry spot, felt himself flying through the air, felt himself without any shock planted upright in an extremely soft and sticky mud bank. It was only when he tried to move his legs and found he couldn't that, in his own words, he came to himself. He began to think of the Ballylong spears. As a matter of fact, considering that the people inside the stockade had to run to the gate, then get down to the landing place, get into boats, and pull round a point of land, he had more advance than he imagined. Besides, it being low water, the creek was without water. You couldn't call it dry, and practically he was safe for a time from everything, but a very long shot perhaps. The higher firm ground was about 6 feet in front of him. "I thought I would have to die there all the same," he said. He reached and grabbed desperately with his hands, and only succeeded in gathering a horrible, cold, shiny heap of slime against his breast, up to his very chin. It seemed to him he was burying himself alive, and then he struck out madly, scattering the mud with his fists. It fell on his head, on his face, over his eyes, into his mouth. He told me that he remembered suddenly the courtyard, as you remember a place where you had been very happy years ago. He longed, so he said, to be back there again, mending the clock. Mending the clock, that was the idea. He made efforts, tremendous, sobbing, gasping efforts that seemed to burst his eyeballs in their sockets and make him blind, and culminating in one mighty, supreme effort in the darkness to crack the earth asunder, to throw it off his limbs, and he felt himself creeping feebly up on the bank. He lay full length on the firm ground and saw the light, the sky. Then, as a sort of happy thought, the notion came to him that he would go to sleep. He will have it that he did actually go to sleep, that he slept, perhaps for a minute, perhaps for 20 seconds, or only for 1 second, but he recollects distinctly the violent, convulsive start of awakening. He remained lying still for a while, and then he arose, muddy from head to foot, and stood there, thinking he was alone of his kind for hundreds of miles, alone, with no help, no sympathy, no pity to expect from anyone, like a hunted animal. The first houses were not more than 20 yards from him, and it was the desperate screaming of a frightened woman trying to carry off a child that started him again. He pelted straight on in his socks, beplastered with filth out of all semblance to a human being. He traversed more than half the length of the settlement. The nimbler women fled right and left. The slower men just dropped whatever they had in their hands and remained petrified with dropping jaws. He was a flying terror. He says he noticed the little children trying to run for life, falling on their little stomachs and kicking. He swerved between 2 houses up a slope, clambered in desperation over a barricade of felled trees — there wasn't a week without some fight in Patusan at the time — burst through a fence into a maize patch where a scared boy flung a stick at him, blundered upon a path, and ran all at once into the arms of several startled men. He just had breath enough to gasp out, "Doramin! Doramin!" He remembers being half carried, half rushed to the top of the slope, and in a vast enclosure with palms and fruit trees being run up to a large man sitting massively in a chair in the midst of the greatest possible commotion and excitement. He fumbled in mud and clothes to produce the ring, and finding himself suddenly on his back, wondered who had knocked him down. They had simply let him go, don't you know, and he couldn't stand. At the foot of the slope random shots were fired, and above the roofs of the settlement there rose a dull roar of amazement. But he was safe. Doramin's people were barricading the gate and pouring water down his throat. Doramin's old wife, full of business and commiseration, was issuing shrill orders to her girls. The old woman, he said softly, made a to-do over me as if I had been her own son. They put me into an immense bed, her state bed, and she ran in and out, wiping her eyes to give me pats on the back. I must have been a pitiful object. I just lay there like a log for I don't know how long. He seemed to have a great liking for Doramin's old wife. She, on her side, had taken a motherly fancy to him. She had a round, nut-brown, soft face, all fine wrinkles, large, bright red lips — she chewed betel assiduously — and screwed-up, winking, benevolent eyes. She was constantly in movement, scolding busily and ordering unceasingly a troop of young women with clear brown faces and big grave eyes, her daughters, her servants, her slave girls. You know how it is in these households. It's generally impossible to tell the difference. She was very spare, and even her ample outer garment, fastened in front with jewelled clasps, had somehow a skimpy effect. Her dark bare feet were thrust into yellow straw slippers of Chinese make. I have seen her myself flitting about with her extremely thick, long grey hair falling about her shoulders. She uttered homely, shrewd sayings, was of noble birth, and was eccentric and arbitrary. In the afternoon she would sit in a very roomy armchair opposite her husband, gazing steadily through a wide opening in the wall, which gave an extensive view of the settlement and the river. She invariably tucked up her feet under her, but old Doramin sat squarely, sat imposingly as a mountain sits on a plain. He was only of the nakhoda, or merchant class, but the respect shown to him and the dignity of his bearing were very striking. He was the chief of the second power in Patusan. The immigrants from Celebes, about 60 families that, with dependents and so on, could muster some 200 men wearing the kriss, had elected him years ago for their head. The men of that race are intelligent, enterprising, revengeful, but with a more frank courage than the other Malays, and restless under oppression. They formed the party opposed to the Rajah. Of course, the quarrels were for trade. This was the primary cause of faction fights, of the sudden outbreaks that would fill this or that part of the settlement with smoke, flame, the noise of shots and shrieks. Villages were burnt, men were dragged into the Rajah's stockade to be killed or tortured for the crime of trading with anybody else but himself. Only a day or two before Jim's arrival, several heads of households in the very fishing village that was afterwards taken under his especial protection had been driven over the cliffs by a party of the Rajah's spearmen on suspicion of having been collecting edible birds' nests for a Celebi's trader. Rajah Alang pretended to be the only trader in his country, and the penalty for the breach of the monopoly was death. But his idea of trading was indistinguishable from the commonest forms of robbery. His cruelty and rapacity had no other bounds than his cowardice, and he was afraid of the organised power of the Celebi's men. Only, till Jim came, he was not afraid enough to keep quiet. He struck at them through his subjects, and thought himself pathetically in the right. The situation was complicated by a wandering stranger, an Arab half-breed, who I believe, on purely religious grounds, had incited the tribes in the interior, the bushfolk, as Jim himself called them, to rise, and had established himself in a fortified camp on the summit of one of the twin hills. He hung over the town of Patusan like a hawk over a poultry yard, but he devastated the open country. Whole villages, deserted, rotted on their blackened posts over the banks of clear streams, dropping piecemeal into the water the grass of their walls, the leaves of their roofs, with a curious effect of natural decay, as if they had been a form of vegetation stricken by a blight at its very root. The two parties in Patusan were not sure which one this partisan most desired to plunder. The Rajah intrigued with him feebly. Some of the Bughi settlers, weary with endless insecurity, were half inclined to call him in. The younger spirits amongst them, chaffing, advised to get Sharif Ali with his wild men and drive the Rajah Alang out of the country. Doraman restrained them with difficulty. He was growing old, and though his influence had not diminished, the situation was getting beyond him. This was the state of affairs when Jim, bolting from the Rajah's stockade, appeared before the chief of the Bugis, produced the ring, and was received, in a manner of speaking, into the heart of the community. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Dan. Chapter 26. Doraman was one of the most remarkable men of his race I had ever seen. His bulk for a Malay was immense, but he did not look merely fat, he looked imposing, monumental. This motionless body, clad in rich stuffs, coloured silks, gold embroideries, this huge head enfolded in a red and gold head-kerchief, the flat, big, round face, wrinkled, furrowed, with two semicircular heavy folds starting on each side of wide, fierce nostrils, and enclosing a thick-lipped mouth, the throat like a bull, the vast corrugated brow overhanging the staring, proud eyes, made a whole that, once seen, can never be forgotten. His impassive repose, he seldom stirred a limb when once he sat down, was like a display of dignity. He was never known to raise his voice. It was a hoarse and powerful murmur, slightly veiled, as if heard from a distance. When he walked, two short, sturdy young fellows, naked to the waist, in white sarongs and with black skull-caps on the backs of their heads, sustained his elbows. They would ease him down and stand behind his chair till he wanted to rise, when he would turn his head slowly, as if with difficulty, to the right and to the left, and then they would catch him under his armpits and help him up. For all that, there was nothing of a cripple about him. On the contrary, all his ponderous movements were like manifestations of a mighty, deliberate force. It was generally believed he consulted his wife as to public affairs, but nobody, as far as I know, had ever heard them exchange a single word. When they sat in state by the wide opening, it was in silence. They could see below them, in the declining light, the vast expanse of the forest country, a dark, sleeping sea of sombre green, undulating as far as the violet and purple range of mountains, the shining sinuosity of the river like an immense letter S of beaten silver, the brown ribbon of houses following the sweep of both banks, overtopped by the twin hills uprising above the nearer tree-tops. They were wonderfully contrasted. She, light, delicate, spare, quick, a little witch-like, with a touch of motherly fussiness in her repose. He, facing her, immense and heavy, like a figure of a man roughly fashioned of stone, with something magnanimous and ruthless in his immobility. The son of these old people was a most distinguished youth. They had him late in life. Perhaps he was not really so young as he looked. 4 or 25 is not so young when a man is already father of a family at 18. When he entered the large room, lined and carpeted with fine mats, and with a high ceiling of white sheeting, where the couple sat in state surrounded by a most deferential retinue, he would make his way straight to Doramin to kiss his hand, which the other abandoned to him majestically, and then would step across to stand by his mother's chair. I suppose I may say they idolized him, but I never caught them giving him an overt glance. Those, it is true, were public functions. The room was generally thronged. The solemn formality of greetings and leave-takings, the profound respect expressed in gestures, on the faces, in the low whispers, is simply indescribable. "It's well worth seeing," Jim had assured me while we were crossing the river on our way back. "They are like people in a book, aren't they?" he said triumphantly. "And Dane Waris, their son, is the best friend, barring you, I ever had. What Mr. Stein would call a good war comrade. I was in luck, Jove, I was in luck when I tumbled amongst them at my last gasp." He meditated with bowed head, then, rousing himself, he added, "Of course I didn't go to sleep over it, but—" He paused again. "It seemed to come to me," he murmured. "All at once I saw what I had to do." There was no doubt that it had come to him, and it had come through war too, as is natural, since this power that came to him was the power to make peace. It is in this sense alone that might so often is right. You must not think he had seen his way at once. When he arrived, the Bugis community was in a most critical position. They were all afraid, he said to me, each man afraid for himself. Well, I could see as plain as possible that they must do something at once if they did not want to go under, one after another, what between the Rajah and that vagabond sheriff. But to see that was nothing. When he got his idea, he had to drive it into reluctant minds through the bulwark of fear, of selfishness. He drove it in at last, and that was nothing. He had to devise the means. He devised them, an audacious plan, and his task was only half done. He had to inspire with his own confidence a lot of people who had hidden and absurd reasons to hang back. He had to conciliate imbecile jealousies and argue away all sorts of senseless mistrusts. Without the weight of Doramin's authority and his son's fiery enthusiasm, he would have failed. Dane Waris, the distinguished youth, was the first to believe in him. Theirs was one of those strange, profound, rare friendships between brown and white, in which the very difference of race seems to draw two human beings closer by some mystic element of sympathy. Of Dane Waris, his own people said with pride that he knew how to fight like a white man. This was true. He had that sort of courage, the courage in the open, I may say, but he had also a European mind. You meet them sometimes like that, and are surprised to discover, unexpectedly, a familiar turn of thought, an unobscured vision, a tenacity of purpose, a touch of altruism. Of small stature, but admirably well proportioned, Dane Waris had a proud carriage, a polished, easy bearing, a temperament like a clear flame. His dusky face, with big black eyes, was in action expressive, and in repose thoughtful. He was of a silent disposition, a firm glance, an ironic smile. A courteous deliberation of manner seemed to hint at great reserves of intelligence and power. Such beings, open to the Western eye, so often concerned with mere surfaces, the hidden possibilities of races and lands over which hangs the mystery of unrecorded ages. He not only trusted Jim, he understood him, I firmly believe. I speak of him because he had captivated me. His, if I may say so, his caustic placidity, and at the same time his intelligent sympathy with Jim's aspirations, appealed to me. I seemed to behold the very origin of friendship. If Jim took the lead, the other had captivated his leader. In fact, Jim, the leader, was a captive in every sense. The land, the people, the friendship, the love, were like the jealous guardians of his body. Every day added a link to the fetters of that strange freedom. I felt convinced of it as from day to day I learned more of the story. The story. Haven't I heard the story? I've heard it on the march, in camp. He made me scour the country after invisible game. I've listened to a good part of it on one of the twin summits after climbing the last 100 feet or so on my hands and knees. Our escorts, we had volunteer followers from village to village, had camped meantime on a bit of level ground halfway up the slope, and in the still, breathless evening the smell of wood smoke reached our nostrils from below with the penetrating delicacy of some choice scent. Voices also ascended, wonderful in their distinct and immaterial clearness. Jim sat on the trunk of a felled tree, and pulling out his pipe began to smoke. A new growth of grass and bushes was springing up. There were traces of an earthwork under a mass of thorny twigs. It all started from here, he said, after a long and meditative silence. On the other hill, 200 yards across a sombre precipice, I saw a line of high blackened stakes, showing here and there ruinously, the remnants of Sheriff Ali's impregnable camp. But it had been taken, though. That had been his idea. He had mounted Doraman's old ordnance on the top of that hill, 2 rusty iron 7-pounders, a lot of small brass cannon, currency cannon. But if the brass guns represent wealth, they can also, when crammed recklessly to the muzzle, send a solid shot to some little distance. The thing was to get them up there. He showed me where he had fastened the cables, explained how he had improvised a rude capstan out of a hollowed log turning upon a pointed stake, indicated with the bowl of his pipe the outline of the earthwork. The last 100 feet of the ascent had been the most difficult. He had made himself responsible for success on his own head. He had induced the war party to work hard all night. Big fires, lighted at intervals, blazed all down the slope. But up here, he explained, the hoisting gang had to fly around in the dark. From the top he saw men moving on the hillside like ants at work. He himself on that night had kept on rushing down and climbing up like a squirrel, directing, encouraging, watching all along the line. Old Doraman had himself carried up the hill in his armchair. They put him down on the level place upon the slope, and he sat there in the light of one of the big fires. "Amazing old chap, real old chieftain," said Jim, with his little fierce eyes, a pair of immense flintlock pistols on his knees. "Magnificent things, ebony, silver-mounted, and with beautiful locks, and a calibre like an old blunderbuss. A present from Stein, it seems, in exchange for that ring, you know. Used to belong to good old McNeil. God only knows how he came by them." There he sat, moving neither hand nor foot, a flame of dry brushwood behind him, and lots of people rushing about, shouting and pulling round him. The most solemn, imposing old chap you can imagine. He wouldn't have had much chance if Sheriff Ali had let his infernal crew loose at us and stampeded my lot, eh? Anyhow, he had come up there to die if anything went wrong. No mistake. Jove, it thrilled me to see him there like a rock. But the sheriff must have thought us mad, and never troubled to come and see how we got on. Nobody believed it could be done. Why, I think the very chaps who pulled and shoved and sweated over it did not believe it could be done. Upon my word, I don't think they did. He stood erect, the smouldering briar-wood in his clutch, with a smile on his lips and a sparkle in his boyish eyes. I sat on the stump of a tree at his feet, and below us stretched the land, the great expanse of the forests, sombre under the sunshine, rolling like a sea, with glints of winding rivers, the grey spots of villages, and here and there a clearing like an islet of light amongst the dark waves of continuous tree-tops. A brooding gloom lay over this vast and monotonous landscape. The light fell on it as if into an abyss. The land devoured the sunshine. Only far off along the coast the empty ocean, smooth and polished within the faint haze, seemed to rise up to the sky in a wall of steel. And there I was with him, high in the sunshine, on the top of that historic hill of his. He dominated the forest, the secular gloom, the old mankind. He was like a figure set up on a pedestal, to represent in his persistent youth the power and perhaps the virtues of races that never grow old, that have emerged from the gloom. I don't know why he should always have appeared to me symbolic. Perhaps this is the real cause of my interest in his fate. I don't know whether it was exactly fair to him to remember the incident which had given a new direction to his life, but at that moment I remembered very distinctly. It was like a shadow in the light. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Dan. Chapter 27. Already the legend had gifted him with supernatural powers. Yes, it was said, there had been many ropes cunningly disposed, and a strange contrivance that turned by the efforts of many men, and each gun went up tearing slowly through the bushes like a wild pig rooting its way in the undergrowth, and the wisest shook their heads. There was something occult in all this, no doubt, for what is the strength of ropes and of men's arms? There is a rebellious soul in things which must be overcome by powerful charms and incantations. Thus old Sura, a very respectable householder of Patusan, with whom I had a quiet chat one evening. However, Sura was a professional sorcerer also, who attended all the rice sowings and reapings for miles around for the purpose of subduing the stubborn souls of things. This occupation he seemed to think a most arduous one, and perhaps the souls of things are more stubborn than the souls of men. As to the simple folk of outlying villages, they believed and said, as the most natural thing in the world, that Jim had carried the guns up the hill on his back, 2 at a time. This would make Jim stamp his foot in vexation and exclaim with an exasperated little laugh, "What can you do with such silly beggars? They will sit up half the night talking bally-rot, and the greater the lie, the more they seem to like it." You could trace the subtle influence of his surroundings in this irritation. It was part of his captivity. The earnestness of his denials was amusing, and at last I said, "My dear fellow, you don't suppose I believe this?" He looked at me quite startled. "Well, no, I suppose not," he said, and burst into a Homeric peal of laughter. "Well, anyhow, the guns were there, and they went off all together at sunrise. Jove, you should have seen the splinters fly," he cried. By his side, Dane Warris, listening with a quiet smile, dropped his eyelids and shuffled his feet a little. It appears that the success in mounting the guns had given Jim's people such a feeling of confidence that he ventured to leave the battery under charge of 2 elderly bogies who had seen some fighting in their day, and went to join Dane Warris and the storming party who were concealed in the ravine. In the small hours they began creeping up, and when 2/3 of the way up, lay in the wet grass, waiting for the appearance of the sun, which was the agreed signal. He told me with what impatient, anguishing emotion he watched the swift coming of the dawn. How, heated with the work and the climbing, he felt the cold dew chilling his very bones. How afraid he was he would begin to shiver and shake like a leaf before the time came for the advance. "It was the slowest half-hour in my life," he declared. Gradually the silent stockade came out on the sky above him. Men scattered all down the slope were crouching among the dark stones and dripping bushes. Dane Warris was lying flattened by his side. "We looked at each other," Jim said, resting a gentle hand on his friend's shoulder. "He smiled at me as cheery as you please, and I dared not stir my lips for fear I would break out into a shivering fit. 'Pon my word, it's true. I had been streaming with perspiration when we took cover, so you may imagine." He declared, and I believed him, that he had no fears as to the result. He was only anxious as to his ability to repress these shivers. He didn't bother about the result. He was bound to get to the top of that hill and stay there, whatever might happen. There could be no going back for him. These people had trusted him implicitly, him alone, his bare word. I remember how at this point he paused with his eyes fixed upon me. As far as he knew, they never had an occasion to regret it yet, he said. Never. He hoped to God they never would. Meantime, worse luck, they had got into the habit of taking his word for anything and everything. I could have no idea. Why, only the other day an old fool he had never seen in his life came from some village miles away to find out if he should divorce his wife. Fact. Solemn word. That's the sort of thing. He wouldn't have believed it. Would I? Squatted on the veranda, chewing betel nuts, sighing and spitting all over the place for more than an hour, and as glum as an undertaker before he came out with that dashed conundrum. That's the kind of thing that isn't so funny as it looks. What was a fellow to say? Good wife? Yes. Good wife. Old, though. Started a confounded long story about some brass pots. Been living together for 15 years, 20 years, could not tell. A long, long time. Good wife. Beat her a little, not much, just a little, when she was young. Had to, for the sake of his honour. Suddenly, in her old age, she goes and lends 3 brass pots to her sister's son's wife, and begins to abuse him every day in a loud voice. His enemies jeered at him. His face was utterly blackened. Potts totally lost, awfully cut up about it. Impossible to fathom a story like that. Told him to go home and promised to come along myself and settle it all. It's all very well to grin, but it was the dashdest nuisance. A day's journey through the forest, another day lost in coaxing a lot of silly villagers to get at the rights of the affair. There was the making of a sanguinary shindy in the thing. Every bally idiot took sides with one family or the other, and one half of the village was ready to go for the other half with anything that came handy. Honour bright, no joke. Instead of attending to their bally crops. Got in the infernal pots back, of course, and pacified all hands. No trouble to settle it. Of course not. Could settle the deadliest quarrel in the country by crooking his little finger. The trouble was to get at the truth of anything. Was not sure to this day whether he had been fair to all parties. It worried him. And the talk, Jove, there didn't seem to be any head or tail to it. Rather storm a 20-foot high old stockade any day. Much. Child's play to that other job. Wouldn't take so long either. Well, yes, a funny set out upon the whole. The fool looked old enough to be his grandfather, but from another point of view it was no joke. His word decided everything, ever since the smashing of Sheriff Ali. An awful responsibility, he repeated. No, really, joking apart, had it been 3 lives instead of 3 rotten brass pots, it would have been the same. Thus he illustrated the moral effect of his victory in war. It was, in truth, immense. It had led him from strife to peace, and through death into the innermost life of the people. But the gloom of the land spread out under the sunshine preserved its appearance of inscrutable, of secular repose. The sound of his fresh young voice, it's extraordinary how very few signs of wear he showed, floated lightly, and passed away over the unchanged face of the forests like the sound of the big guns on that cold dewy morning when he had no other concern on earth but the proper control of the chills in his body. With the first slant of sun rays along these immovable tree-tops, the summit of one hill wreathed itself with heavy reports in white clouds of smoke, and the other burst into an amazing noise of yells, war-cries, shouts of anger, of surprise, of dismay. Jim and Dane Warris were the first to lay their hands on the stakes. The popular story has it that Jim, with a touch of one finger, had thrown down the gate. He was, of course, anxious to disclaim this achievement. The whole stockade, he would insist on explaining to you, was a poor affair. Sheriff Ali trusted mainly to the inaccessible position, and anyway the thing had been already knocked to pieces and only hung together by a miracle. He put his shoulder to it like a little fool and went in head over heels. Jove, if it hadn't been for Dane Warris, a pock-marked, tattooed vagabond would have pinned him with his spear to a bulk of timber like one of Stein's beetles. The third man in, it seems, had been Tam Bitan, Jim's own servant. This was a Malay from the north, a stranger who had wandered into Patusan and been forcibly detained by Raja Alang as paddler of one of the state boats. He had made a bolt for it at the first opportunity, and finding a precarious refuge, but very little to eat, among the Bugis settlers, had attached himself to Jim's person. His complexion was very dark, his face flat, his eyes prominent and injected with bile. There was something excessive, almost fanatical, in his devotion to his white lord. He was inseparable from Jim, like a morose shadow. On state occasions he would tread on his master's heels, one hand on the haft of his kriss, keeping the common people at a distance by his truculent brooding glances. Jim had made him the head man of his establishment, and all Patusan respected and courted him as a person of much influence. At the taking of the stockade he had distinguished himself greatly by the methodical ferocity of his fighting. The storming party had come on so quick, Jim said, that notwithstanding the panic of the garrison, there was a hot 5 minutes hand to hand inside that stockade, till some bally-ass set fire to the shelters of boughs and dry grass, and we all had to clear out for dear life. The rout, it seems, had been complete. Doraman, waiting immovably in his chair on the hillside, with the smoke of the guns spreading slowly above his big head, received the news with a deep grunt. When informed that his son was safe and leading the pursuit, he, without another sound, made a mighty effort to rise. His attendants hurried to his help, and held up reverently, he shuffled with great dignity into a bit of shade, where he laid himself down to sleep, covered entirely with a piece of white sheeting. In Patusan the excitement was intense. Jim told me that from the hill, turning his back on the stockade with its embers, black ashes, and half-consumed corpses, he could see time after time the open spaces between the houses on both sides of the stream fill suddenly with a seething rush of people and get empty in a moment. His ears caught feebly from below the tremendous din of gongs and drums. The wild shouts of the crowd reached him in bursts of faint roaring. A lot of streamers made a flutter as of little white, red, yellow birds amongst the brown ridges of roofs. "You must have enjoyed it," I murmured, feeling the stir of sympathetic emotion. It was immense, immense," he cried aloud, flinging his arms open. The sudden movement startled me, as though I had seen him bare the secrets of his breast to the sunshine, to the brooding forests, to the steely sea. Below us the town reposed in easy curves upon the banks of a stream whose current seemed to sleep. "Immense," he repeated for a third time, speaking in a whisper, for himself alone. Immense. No doubt it was immense. The seal of success upon his words, the conquered ground for the soles of his feet, the blind trust of men, the belief in himself snatched from the fire, the solitude of his achievement. All this, as I've warned you, gets dwarfed in the telling. I can't, with mere words, convey to you the impression of his total and utter isolation. I know, of course, he was in every sense alone of his kind there, but the unsuspected qualities of his nature had brought him in such close touch with his surroundings that this isolation seemed only the effect of his power. His loneliness added to his stature. There was nothing within sight to compare him with, as though he had been one of those exceptional men who can only be measured by the greatness of their fame, and his fame, remember, was the greatest thing around for many a day's journey. You would have to paddle, pole, or track a long, weary way through the jungle before you passed beyond the reach of its voice. Its voice was not the trumpeting of the disreputable goddess we all know, not blatant, not brazen. It took its tone from the stillness and gloom of the land without a past, where his word was the one truth of every passing day. It shared something of the nature of that silence through which it accompanied you into unexplored depths, heard continuously by your side, penetrating, far-reaching, tinged with wonder and mystery on the lips of whispering men. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Dan. Chapter 28. The defeated Sheriff Ali fled the country without making another stand, and when the miserable hunted villagers began to crawl out of the jungle back to their rotting houses, It was Jim who, in consultation with Dane Waris, appointed the headmen. Thus he became the virtual ruler of the land. As to old Tunku Arlang, his fears at first had known no bounds. It is said that at the intelligence of the successful storming of the hill, he flung himself face down on the bamboo floor of his audience hall, and lay motionless for a whole night and a whole day, uttering stifled sounds of such an appalling nature that no man dared approach his prostrate form nearer than a spear's length. Already he could see himself driven ignominiously out of Patusan, wandering, abandoned, stripped, without opium, without his women, without followers, a fair game for the first comer to kill. After Sheriff Ali, his turn would come, and who could resist an attack led by such a devil? And indeed he owed his life, and such authority as he still possessed at the time of my visit, to Jim's idea of what was fair alone. The Boogies had been extremely anxious to pay off old scores, and the impassive old Doraman cherished the hope of yet seeing his son ruler of Patusan. During one of our interviews he deliberately allowed me to get a glimpse of this secret ambition. Nothing could be finer in its way than the dignified wariness of his approaches. He himself, he began by declaring, had used his strength in his young days, but now he had grown old and tired. With his imposing bulk and haughty little eyes darting sagacious, inquisitive glances, he reminded one irresistibly of a cunning old elephant. The slow rise and fall of his vast breast went on powerful and regular, like the heave of a calm sea. He too, as he protested, had an unbounded confidence in Tuan Jim's wisdom. If he could only obtain a promise, one word would be enough. His breathing silences, the low rumblings of his voice, recalled the last efforts of a spent thunderstorm. I tried to put the subject aside. It was difficult, for there could be no question that Jim had the power. In his new sphere there did not seem to be anything that was not his to hold or to give. But that, I repeat, was nothing in comparison with the notion, which occurred to me while I listened with a show of attention, that he seemed to have come very near at last to mastering his fate. Doraman was anxious about the future of the country, and I was struck by the turn he gave to the argument. The land remains where God had put it, but white men, he said, they come to us, and in a little while they go away. Those they leave behind do not know when to look for their return. They go to their own land, to their people, and so this white man too would. I don't know what induced me to commit myself at this point to a vigorous "No, no." The whole extent of this indiscretion became apparent when Doraman, turning full upon me his face, whose expression, fixed in rugged, deep folds, remained unalterable, like a huge brown mask, said that this was good news indeed, reflectively, and then wanted to know why. His little motherly witch of a wife sat on my other hand, with her head covered and her feet tucked up, gazing through the great shutter-hole. I could only see a straying lock of grey hair, a high cheek-bone, the slight masticating motion of the sharp chin. Without removing her eyes from the vast prospect of forest stretching as far as the hills, she asked me, in a pitying voice, why it was that he, so young, had wandered from his home, coming so far, through so many dangers. Had he no household there, no kinsman in his own country? Had he no old mother who would always remember his face? I was completely unprepared for this. I could only mutter and shake my head vaguely. Afterwards, I am perfectly aware, I cut a very poor figure trying to extricate myself out of this difficulty. From that moment, however, the old nakhoda became taciturn. He was not very pleased, I fear, and evidently I had given him food for thought. Strangely enough, on the evening of that very day, which was my last in Patusan, I was once more confronted with the same question, with the unanswerable why of Jim's fate. And this brings me to the story of his love. I suppose you think it is a story that you can imagine for yourselves. We've heard so many such stories, and the majority of us don't believe them to be stories of love at all. For the most part, we look upon them as stories of opportunities. Episodes of passion at best, or perhaps only of youth and temptation, doomed to forgetfulness in the end, even if they pass through the reality of tenderness and regret. This view, mostly, is right, and perhaps in this case too. Yet, I don't know. To tell this story is by no means so easy as it should be, were the ordinary standpoint adequate. Apparently it is a story very much like the others. For me, however, there is visible in its background the melancholy figure of a woman, the shadow of a cruel wisdom buried in a lonely grave, looking on wistfully, helplessly, with sealed lips. The grave itself, as I came upon it during an early morning stroll, was a rather shapeless brown mound, with an inlaid neat border of white lumps of coral at the base, and enclosed within a circular fence made of split saplings, with the bark left on. A garland of leaves and flowers was woven about the heads of the slender posts, and the flowers were fresh. Thus, whether the shadow is of my imagination or not, I can at all events point out the significant fact of an unforgotten grave. When I tell you, besides, that Jim, with his own hands, had worked at the rustic fence, you will perceive directly the difference, the individual side of the story. There is, in his espousal of memory and affection belonging to another human being, something characteristic of his seriousness. He had a conscience, and it was a romantic conscience. Through her whole life, the wife of the unspeakable Cornelius had no other companion, confidant, and friend but her daughter. How the poor woman had come to marry the awful little Malacca Portuguese after the separation from the father of her girl, and how that separation had been brought about, whether by death, which can be sometimes merciful, or by the merciless pressure of conventions, is a mystery to me. From the little witch Stein, who knew so many stories, had let drop in my hearing, I am convinced that she was no ordinary woman. Her own father had been white, a high official, one of the brilliantly endowed men who are not dull enough to nurse a success, and whose careers so often end under a cloud. I suppose she too must have lacked the saving dullness, and her career ended in Patusan. Our common fate, for where is the man, I mean a real sentient man, who does not remember vaguely having been deserted in the fullness of possession by someone or something more precious than life? Our common fate fastens upon the women with a peculiar cruelty. It does not punish like a master, but inflicts lingering torment, as if to gratify a secret, unappeasable spite. One would think that, appointed to rule on earth, it seeks to revenge itself upon the beings that come nearest to rising above the trammels of earthly caution, for it is only women who manage to put at times into their love an element just palpable enough to give one a fright, an extraterrestrial touch. I ask myself with wonder how the world can look to them, whether it has the shape and substance we know, the air we breathe. Sometimes I fancy it must be a region of unreasonable sublimity seething with the excitement of their adventurous souls, lighted by the glory of all possible risks and renunciations. However, I suspect there are very few women in the world, though of course I am aware of the multitudes of mankind, and of the equality of sexes, in point of numbers, that is. But I am sure that the mother was as much of a woman as the daughter seemed to be. I cannot help picturing to myself these two, at first the young woman and the child, then the old woman and the young girl, the awful sameness and the swift passage of time, the barrier of forest, the solitude, and the turmoil round these two lonely lives, and every word spoken between them penetrated with sad meaning. There must have been confidences, not so much of fact, I suppose, as of innermost feelings, regrets, fears, warnings, no doubt, warnings that the younger did not fully understand till the elder was dead, and Jim came along. Then I am sure she understood much, not everything, the fear mostly, it seems. Jim called her by a word that means precious in the sense of a precious gem, jewel. Pretty, isn't it? But he was capable of anything. He was equal to his fortune, as he, after all, must have been equal to his misfortune. Jewel, he called her, And he would say this as he might have said Jane, don't you know, with a marital, home-like, peaceful effect. I heard the name for the first time 10 minutes after I had landed in his courtyard, when, after nearly shaking my arm off, he darted up the steps and began to make a joyous, boyish disturbance at the door under the heavy eaves. "Jewel! Oh, Jewel! Quick! Here's a friend come!" And suddenly peering at me in the dim veranda, he mumbled earnestly, "You know, this no confounded nonsense about it. Can't tell you how much I owe to her. And so, you understand, exactly as if—" His hurried, anxious whispers were cut short by the flitting of a white form within the house, a faint exclamation, and a childlike but energetic little face with delicate features and a profound, attentive glance peeped out of the inner gloom, like a bird out of the recess of a nest. I was struck by the name, of course, but it was not till later on that I connected it with an astonishing rumour that had met me on my journey at a little place on the coast about 230 miles south of Patusan River. Stein's schooner, in which I had my passage, put in there to collect some produce, and going ashore I found, to my great surprise, that the wretched locality could boast of a third-class deputy assistant resident, a big, fat, greasy, blinking fellow of mixed descent, with turned-out, shiny lips. I found him lying extended on his back in a cane-chair, odiously unbuttoned, with a large green leaf of some sort on the top of his steaming head, and another in his hand, which he used lazily as a fan. "Going to Patusan?" "Oh, yes, Stein's Trading Company. He knew. Had a permission? No business of his. It was not so bad there now," he remarked negligently, and went on drawling. "There's some sort of white vagabond has got in there, I hear. Eh? What you say? Friend of yours? So. Then it was true there was one of these verdammt. What was he up to? Found his way in, the rascal, eh? I had not been sure. Patusan. They cut throats there. No business of ours." He interrupted himself to go, "Whoa, almighty, the heat, the heat. Well then, there might be something in the story too, after all, and—" He shut one of his beastly glassy eyes. The eyelid went on quivering, while he leered at me atrociously with the other. "Look here," says he mysteriously, do you understand, if he has really got hold of something fairly good, none of your bits of green glass, understand. I am a government official, you tell the rascal, eh? What? Friend of yours?" He continued wallowing calmly in the chair. "You said so, that's just it, and I am pleased to give you the hint. I suppose you too would like to get something out of it. Don't interrupt. You just tell him I have heard the tale, but to my government I have made no report. Not yet. See? Or make a report, eh? Tell him to come to me if they let him get alive out of the country. He had better look out for himself, eh? I promise to ask no questions. On the quiet, you understand. You too. You shall get something from me. Small commission for the trouble. Don't interrupt. I am a government official, and make no report. That's business, understand? I know some good people that will buy anything worth having, and can give him more money than a scoundrel ever saw in his life. I know his sort." He fixed me steadfastly with both his eyes open, while I stood over him utterly amazed, and asking myself whether he was mad or drunk. He perspired, puffed, moaning feebly, and scratching himself with such horrible composure that I could not bear the sight long enough to find out. Next day, talking casually with the people of the little native court of the place, I discovered that a story was travelling slowly down the coast about a mysterious white man in Patusan who had got hold of an extraordinary gem, namely an emerald of an enormous size and altogether priceless. The emerald seemed to appeal more to the Eastern imagination than any other precious stone. The white man had obtained it, I was told, partly by the exercise of his wonderful strength, and partly by cunning, from the ruler of a distant country, whence he had fled instantly, arriving in Patusan in utmost distress, but frightening the people by his extreme ferocity, which nothing seemed able to subdue. Most of my informants were of the opinion that the stone was probably unlucky, like the famous stone of the Sultan of Sakadana, which in the old times had brought wars and untold calamities upon that country. Perhaps it was the same stone, one couldn't say. Indeed, the story of a fabulously large emerald is as old as the arrival of the first white men in the archipelago, and the belief in it is so persistent that less than 40 years ago there had been an official Dutch inquiry into the truth of it. Such a jewel, it was explained to me by the old fellow from whom I heard most of this amazing Jim myth, a sort of scribe to the wretched little Rajah of the place. Such a jewel, he said, cocking his poor purblind eyes up at me, he was sitting on the cabin floor out of respect, is best preserved by being concealed about the person of a woman. Yet it is not every woman that would do. She must be young, he sighed deeply, and insensible to the seductions of love. He shook his head sceptically. But such a woman seemed to be actually in existence. He had been told of a tall girl whom the white man treated with great respect and care, and who never went forth from the house unattended. People said the white man could be seen with her almost any day. They walked side by side, openly, he holding her arm under his, pressed to his side, thus, in a most extraordinary way. This might be a lie, he conceded, for it was indeed a strange thing for anyone to do. On the other hand, there could be no doubt she wore the white man's jewel concealed upon her bosom. End of chapter 28.